At my own granddaughter's wedding, they handed me a name tag that said I didn't exist. I read the words twice before I let myself breathe, the elegant script curling across thick ivory cardstock as if it belonged there, as if someone had carefully chosen each letter to say exactly what they meant without ever raising their voice. The absent old lady. I turned the tag slightly in my hand, letting the chandelier light catch the gold trim, and for a moment, I almost admired the craftsmanship. Whoever designed it had taste. Subtle, polished, cruel in a way that didn't leave. Fingerprints, I smiled. Of course I did. Because at 67 years old, you learn that the most dangerous reaction is the one you don't show. And then I pinned it to my dress, smoothing the fabric over my chest as if it were just another accessory. Just another harmless detail on a day that was supposed to be beautiful. The ballroom at the Grand Lakeside Hotel stretched out in front of me. All white roses and crystal glassware. Tables arranged in perfect symmetry like a photograph in a bridal magazine. Waiters moved quietly between guests carrying trays of champagne. Laughter floated through the air, light and effortless, the kind of sound that comes from people who believe they belong exactly where they are. I stepped inside without announcing myself. No one turned. No one paused. Not even my own son. Daniel stood near the center of the room in a tailored navy suit, his arm resting lightly around Vanessa's waist. They were smiling at someone. Maybe a business partner. Maybe a friend. I couldn't tell anymore, because somewhere along the way, I had stopped recognizing the people in his life, or perhaps he had stopped wanting me to. Olivia, my granddaughter, stood across the room in her wedding gown, a cascade of white silk that caught the light with every small movement. She looked radiant. She looked happy, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to feel proud. I had watched her grow up, held her when she cried, paid for piano lessons she later quit, wrote checks for college tuition without ever asking for thanks. And today, I had paid for this. All of this. The venue, the flowers, the catering, every detail that made this day possible. And yet, there I was, standing at the edge of the room with a label that suggested I had never been part of it at all. I walked past a group of guests who glanced at me just long enough to register that I was someone unfamiliar, their eyes flickering briefly to the name tag before moving on, polite enough not to stare, indifferent enough not to care. I found my seat eventually, table 17, tucked near the back beside a service station where waiters exchanged empty trays for full ones, close enough to the celebration to hear it, far enough to be forgotten. I pulled out my chair slowly, careful not to disturb the place setting. The silverware aligned perfectly, the napkin folded into a shape that probably had a name I didn't know. I placed my clutch on the table and sat down, crossing my legs neatly. The band began to play something soft and familiar, and I watched as guests leaned into each other, sharing stories, raising glasses, existing in a world that had somehow continued without me. And that was when I noticed something else. My name wasn't just missing from the tag. It was missing from everything, from the printed program at each table, from the list of acknowledgments, from the small speech card resting beside the microphone stand at the front of the room. I picked up the program and scanned it once, then again, slower this time. Sponsors were listed, family members were thanked. Even distant relatives had found their place in neat black ink. But not me, not Margaret Collins, not the woman who had quietly funded every inch of this celebration. I set the program down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table as if precision might restore some sense of order. Across the room, Vanessa leaned toward Daniel and whispered something. He nodded without looking in my direction, and Olivia laughed at a joke someone else had made, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a guest I didn't recognize. I could have stood up then, could have walked over, could have asked a simple question that would force them to acknowledge me, but I didn't, because something about the way this had been done, so carefully, so deliberately, told me that this wasn't an accident. This was a decision, a quiet erasure wrapped in elegance. And as I sat there, feeling the weight of that realization settle into something cold and steady, I understood that this moment, this small, polished humiliation, was only the beginning of a story they thought I would never tell. And that was their first mistake. I had always believed that absence was something that happened slowly, like a chair left empty at the dinner table or a voice that stopped calling your name over time, not something that could be assigned to you in ink and handed over with a polite smile at the entrance of a ballroom. Yet there I was, sitting at table 17, watching a celebration I had helped build unfold as if I were a distant guest who had wandered in by mistake. The music softened as the officiant stepped forward to begin the formal introductions, and I straightened slightly in my chair out of habit, the same way I had done at every school recital, every graduation, every moment in Olivia's life that had mattered, expecting nothing more than a simple acknowledgement, a small thread connecting me to the story being told. But as the names were read one by one, family members, friends, even business associates whose connection felt thinner than paper, my own name never came, not once, not even in passing, and I realized then that what I had first thought was a careless oversight was in fact something far more deliberate, something constructed with intention and care, like the seating chart or the floral arrangements, designed to place each person exactly where they were meant to be, including me, exactly where I was not meant to be seen. I reached for the glass of water in front of me and took a slow sip, letting the coolness settle the tightness in my chest. Not panic, not even anger, just a quiet understanding unfolding piece by piece across the room. Vanessa was speaking with a group of women dressed in soft pastels, her posture perfect, her smile effortless, the kind of smile that made people trust her without question. I had seen that smile before, years ago, when she first entered our family, when she called me mom with a warmth that felt genuine, when she asked for advice about recipes and home decor and pretended to value my opinions. I had believed her then, because I wanted to. Believe that my son had chosen someone who would care for him, someone who would care for us all. But now, watching her from across the room, I noticed the way her eyes moved, calculating, always aware of who was watching, who was listening, who mattered, and who did not. Daniel stood beside her, nodding occasionally, his attention drifting between conversations, his expression polite but distant, as if he were attending a function rather than participating in something personal. I wondered when that distance had begun, when the small calls had turned into brief messages, when the visits had become holidays only, and when even those had started to feel like obligations rather than invitations. The band transitioned into a brighter melody, signaling the start of the reception proper. Guests began to rise from their seats, laughter growing louder, glasses clinking, and still, no one approached my table, no one asked if I needed anything. No one even glanced in my direction long enough to recognize me as part of the family whose name they were celebrating. I picked up the program again, tracing the printed words with my finger: sponsors, contributors, acknowledgments, each line carefully chosen, each name given its place, and yet the absence of mine spoke louder than any inclusion could have. It was not that they had forgotten, it was that they had decided I did not belong in the narrative they were presenting to the world. And that decision required planning, coordination, agreement. It required conversations I had not been part of, decisions made in rooms where my voice had not been invited. I set the program down once more, aligning it with the edge of the table as I had before, a small act of control in a situation that seemed designed to take control away from me. A waiter passed by and paused briefly, offering a polite smile before asking if I would like champagne. I nodded, and he placed a glass in front of me without hesitation, without recognition. Just another guest, just another face. I thanked him softly, my voice steady. And as he moved on, I allowed myself a single glance around the room, taking in every detail, every interaction, every carefully constructed moment that excluded me while pretending I had never been meant to be included. And in that quiet observation, something shifted, not outwardly, not in any way that anyone else could see, but internally, a subtle realignment, like a piece of a puzzle finally finding its place. Because this was no longer about a name tag or a missing line in a program. This was about understanding the shape of the story they had written without me, and more importantly, recognizing that I still held the pen to a chapter they had not yet considered. I lifted the glass of champagne and held it for a moment before taking a measured sip, the bubbles sharp against my tongue. And as the room filled with celebration, I sat there calmly, quietly, no longer wondering why I had been placed at the edge, but beginning to see exactly how far that edge extended and what might happen when someone decided to step beyond it. The first toast began with a soft chime of a glass, the kind that gently asks for attention without demanding it, and the room responded immediately, conversations fading, bodies turning, eyes lifting toward the center where Olivia, and her new husband stood beneath a canopy of white roses. I watched as Daniel stepped forward with a microphone in his hand, his posture confident, his voice steady as he welcomed everyone and thanked them for being part of such a meaningful day. He spoke about love, about family, about the importance of support and shared memories. Each word carefully chosen, each sentence practiced enough to sound natural. And as he continued, I listened closely, not to what he said, but to what he did not say. There were stories about Olivia's childhood, about her kindness, her determination, even a brief mention of how Vanessa had helped plan every detail of the wedding. Her dedication praised in front of a room full of approving smiles. And still, my name did not exist in any part of that narrative. Not in the memories, not in the gratitude, not even as a passing acknowledgement. I held my glass in both hands, resting it lightly against the table, letting the condensation gather against my fingertips as I absorbed the quiet precision of what was happening. This was not a mistake. This was not forgetfulness. This was authorship. They had written a version of this family where I had never played a role, where the years I had spent building, supporting, providing, had been edited out as cleanly as a line removed from a script. Vanessa stepped forward next, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she took the microphone from Daniel. She smiled at the crowd, that same effortless smile that made people lean in, that made them believe they were witnessing something genuine, something warm. She spoke about Olivia as if she had been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every late night of studying, weaving herself seamlessly into a history that had begun long before she arrived. And as she spoke, I noticed the way guests nodded, the way they accepted her version of events without question, because it was easier, because it was presented with confidence, because there was no one contradicting it. I glanced down at my name tag again, the words still sharp, still deliberate, and I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to see before. Absence is not always about being physically gone. Sometimes it is about being replaced, redefined, rewritten until your presence no longer fits the story others want to tell. The applause came easily, filling the room with warmth that felt borrowed, rehearsed, and I joined in, my hands moving gently, rhythmically, as if I were part of the same celebration, as if I belonged in the same narrative. But inside, something had settled into clarity, a stillness that replaced the earlier confusion. I began to notice more now. The small exchanges that happened between glances, the subtle nods between Vanessa and Daniel, the way Olivia avoided looking toward the back of the room, as if acknowledging me might disrupt the version of reality they had all agreed upon. A server approached with a tray of plated salads, setting one down in front of me with a polite smile. I thanked him again, my voice calm, consistent, the same voice I had used for decades to keep peace, to smooth over discomfort, to make others feel at ease. And for a moment, I considered what would happen if I broke that pattern, if I stood up and spoke, if I asked a question loud enough for the room to hear. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because I understood now that this was not the kind of moment that responded well to noise. This required something else, something quieter, something far more precise. I picked up my fork and took a small bite, tasting nothing, my attention no longer on the food, but on the structure of the evening itself. The timing of events, the sequence of speeches, the flow of attention from one moment to the next. And in that observation, I began to see where the seams were, where something could be introduced, where a single shift could alter the entire direction of the story unfolding in front of me. Across the room, Vanessa leaned toward Olivia, whispering something that made her laugh softly, a controlled, delicate laugh that matched the elegance of everything else around her. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to smile, not out of habit, but out of understanding, because they believed this was complete. They believed the story had already been told, that every role had been assigned, that every voice that mattered had already spoken. And as I sat there at table 17, quietly observing, quietly listening, I knew something they did not. The evening was not over, and neither was I. I had always told myself that memories were the only things no one could take from you. That no matter how people changed or how circumstances shifted, what you had lived, what you had given, would remain untouched somewhere inside you. But as I sat there watching the evening unfold, I realized that memories could be rewritten just as easily as anything else when the people who shared them decided to tell a different version. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the soft hum of conversation to wash over me as dinner was served. Plates replaced one by one with practiced efficiency, each course arriving exactly on time, as if the entire night were following a script written long before any of us had stepped into the room. And perhaps it had been. Perhaps every detail had been planned with the same careful intention as the name tag that still rested against my chest. I let my fingers brush lightly over it, not to remove it, not to hide it, but to remind myself that it was real, that this moment was not something I had imagined or misunderstood. Across the room, Olivia was moving from table to table, greeting guests, her smile bright, her posture graceful. She stopped at nearly every table, leaning in, accepting congratulations, posing for photographs, creating memories that would be shared and remembered long after this night ended. And yet she never made her way toward mine, not once, not even by accident, as if the path that led to table 17 had been carefully erased from her map. I watched her for a moment longer before lowering my gaze, not out of hurt, but out of recognition, because I had seen this pattern before, not in moments this large, but in smaller, quieter ways that had been easier to dismiss at the time. The birthday dinner 2 years ago when the invitation had arrived a day late, the holiday gathering where my seat had been given to someone else with a casual apology, the phone calls that grew shorter, less frequent, until they became nothing more than polite check-ins that said everything and nothing at the same time. Each moment on its own had seemed insignificant, easy to explain, easy to forgive, but together they formed a pattern that was no longer possible to ignore. I had not been removed all at once. I had been gently moved aside, step by step, until the distance between us felt natural, inevitable, even justified in a way that no one had ever needed to say out loud. A soft laugh drew my attention to the table beside me, where a group of guests were discussing the wedding, their voices light, their words casual. Vanessa really outdid herself, one woman said. She practically made this whole thing happen. Another nodded in agreement, adding, "It is incredible what she has done for Olivia. She is so lucky to have her." I listened quietly, not turning my head, not interrupting, just allowing their words to settle into place alongside everything else I had observed that evening. And with each sentence, the picture became clearer. Vanessa had not only inserted herself into the story, she had positioned herself at its center, rewriting the roles in a way that made her indispensable, irreplaceable, while quietly removing anyone who might challenge that narrative, including me. I picked up my glass again, taking a slow sip, the champagne now slightly warmer, its sharpness softened, much like the edges of the truth I was beginning to understand. This was not about a single event. This was not about a name tag or a missing acknowledgement. This was about control, about who held it, who defined the story, who decided which voices were heard and which were quietly erased. And as that realization settled, I felt something shift once more, not in the room, not in the people around me, but within myself, a calm clarity that replaced any lingering doubt. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand the structure, you cannot unsee it. You cannot return to the comfort of believing that everything is as it appears. I placed my glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as I had done with the program. Small, precise movements that grounded me in a moment that had been designed to unbalance me. And then I did something I had not done all evening. I looked directly toward the center of the room, not as an observer, not as someone standing at the edge, but as someone who understood exactly where she stood within it. Daniel was laughing now, his hand resting on Vanessa's shoulder, Olivia beside them, her smile radiant, her attention focused entirely on the people in front of her. And for the first time that evening, I did not feel invisible. I felt something else. Entirely, I felt patient. Because stories like this, carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, often depend on one thing above all else: the belief that no one will challenge them, that no one will step forward and offer a different version. And as I sat there at table 17, surrounded by a celebration that had been built in part by my own hands, I understood that the story they had chosen to tell was not the only one that existed. And more importantly, it was not the only one that could be heard. It was somewhere between the main course and the next round of speeches that the evening began to reveal something it had been carefully trying to hide. Not in any dramatic way, not with raised voices or obvious tension, but in the quiet, almost invisible exchanges that most people would overlook if they were not paying close attention. I noticed it first when Vanessa stepped away from the center of the room, her smile softening into something more controlled as she moved toward a man standing near the far wall. He was older, well-dressed, the kind of presence that suggested authority without needing to announce it. I watched as she spoke to him in low tones, her posture shifting slightly, less performative, more intentional, and then Daniel joined them, his expression serious for the first time that evening. The three of them forming a small circle that felt separate from the celebration around them. I did not need to hear their words to understand that this conversation mattered, that it carried weight beyond polite introductions or casual remarks. I set my fork down quietly, my attention no longer on the meal in front of me, but on the rhythm of the room, the way certain moments flowed while others seemed to pause just long enough to signal that something else was happening beneath the surface. A server approached to clear my plate, offering a brief smile that I returned with equal politeness. And as he moved on, I rose from my chair slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress as I did, not in haste, not with any sense of urgency that might draw attention, just a simple, measured movement that allowed me to step away from table 17 and into the edges of the room where observation came more easily. I moved along the perimeter, passing groups of guests engaged in light conversation, their voices blending into a soft background hum, until I found myself near enough to hear fragments of the conversation Vanessa and Daniel were having. Not enough to catch every word, but enough to understand the tone, the intent. "We just need to finalize it after tonight," Vanessa said, her voice calm, controlled. "There is no reason to delay any longer." Daniel nodded, his reply quieter, but firm. "Everything is already in place, it is. Just a matter of timing." The man with them glanced briefly around the room before responding. "As long as she does not interfere, it should be straightforward." There was a slight pause, and then Vanessa let out a soft, almost dismissive laugh. "She will not. She has already made it clear she prefers to stay out of things." I felt something settle into place inside me. Not shock, not even surprise, just confirmation. A final piece clicking into a pattern I had already begun to see. I stepped back before my presence could be noticed, returning to my seat with the same quiet composure I had maintained all evening. But now, the room felt different, not because anything had visibly changed, but because I understood something I had not fully understood before. This was not only about rewriting the past, this was about controlling the future, about making decisions that would extend far beyond this night. Decisions that had been discussed, planned, agreed upon without my knowledge, without my involvement, and yet, somehow, still depended on my absence to succeed. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, my gaze steady as I looked toward the center of the room once more, where Olivia was now dancing, her laughter bright, her movements light, surrounded by guests who celebrated her without question, and I felt a brief, quiet ache, not for myself, but for the simplicity of what this day could have been, what it should have been, a celebration of family, of connection, of shared history. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the same calm clarity that had been building throughout the evening. Because now I knew. Now I understood the scope of what was happening, the intention behind it, the quiet assumption that I would remain exactly where they had placed me, at the edge, unnoticed, uninvolved, and most importantly, silent. I reached for my clutch, opening it with a deliberate, unhurried motion. Inside, everything was exactly where I had left it, neat, organized, untouched. I ran my fingers lightly over its contents, not searching, not hesitating, just confirming. And then I closed it again, placing it back on the table with the same precision I had used for every small movement that evening. Across the room, Vanessa caught Daniel's eye, giving him a small nod that seemed to signal something had been decided, something had moved forward as planned, and Daniel responded in kind, his expression easing, his posture relaxing as if a weight had been lifted, and I realized then that whatever they believed had been settled, whatever they thought had been secured, rested on a single assumption, that I would remain exactly as they had defined me. Absent, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not directed at anyone in particular, not meant to be seen or understood, just a quiet acknowledgement of the truth as I now saw it, because absence, as they understood it, was not something I had chosen. It was something they had assigned, something they had counted on. And as I sat there, composed, attentive, fully aware of every detail unfolding around me, I understood something they did not. Absence can be reversed, and when it is, it has a way of changing everything that follows. The music shifted again, slower now, signaling the transition into what most people would remember as the heart of the evening, the first dance, the moment when attention narrowed and the room softened, and I watched as Olivia stepped onto the floor, her hand resting lightly in her husband's, her smile practiced but convincing, the kind of smile that photographs well and tells a story people want to believe. The lights dimmed just enough to create intimacy, just enough to draw every eye toward them, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background, the conversations, the subtle movements, even the quiet calculations that had been unfolding all night. But I did not let myself be pulled into that illusion, not anymore. Instead, I observed, carefully, the timing, the sequence, the way events were layered to guide attention exactly where it was meant to go. Because now I understood that control was not always loud. It was often subtle, structured, built into the flow of things. So naturally that no one questioned it. I reached for my clutch again, this time opening it with purpose, my fingers moving with quiet certainty as I retrieved my phone, the screen lighting up softly in my hand. I did not rush. I did not glance around to see if anyone was watching, because I had learned long ago that the most effective actions are the ones that appear ordinary. I scrolled briefly, stopping at a name I had not needed to contact in quite some time, and for a moment, I simply looked at it, not hesitating, not second-guessing, just acknowledging the step I was about to take. Then I pressed call, holding the phone to my ear as I kept my gaze directed toward the dance floor, where Olivia and her husband moved in slow, synchronized steps, their image reflected in the polished surface beneath them, perfect, composed, exactly as it was meant to be seen. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, calm, professional, familiar. "This is Robert Hayes," I allowed myself a small breath before responding, my voice steady, measured, exactly as it had been throughout the evening. "Robert, it is Margaret Collins." There was a brief pause, recognition settling in. "Margaret, I did not expect to hear from you tonight. Is everything all right?" I watched as Vanessa stepped closer to the edge of the dance floor, her attention fixed on Olivia, her expression softening for the audience around her, and I replied simply, "I believe it is time to move forward with the revisions we discussed." Another pause, longer this time, more deliberate. "Are you certain?" he asked, and I did not need to think about my answer. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am." The music swelled slightly, applause beginning to build as the dance neared its end, and Robert's voice returned, more focused now. "Then I will prepare everything immediately. We can have the documents finalized within 24 hours. I nodded once, though he could not see it. "That will be fine," I said. "I would also like you to attend the remainder of the evening if possible." There was a subtle shift in his tone, an understanding of what that request meant. "I can be there within 30 minutes, he replied. "Good," I said softly. "I will expect you." And then I ended the call, lowering the phone and placing it back into my clutch with the same care I had used for every movement that night. Nothing rushed, nothing out of place, across the room. The dance concluded, the applause rising fully now, guests smiling, some even wiping away small tears as if they had just witnessed something deeply meaningful. And I joined them once again, my hands coming together in a quiet, steady rhythm, my expression unchanged, because from the outside, nothing had shifted. The evening continued exactly as planned. The story remained intact, the roles unchanged. But beneath that surface, something had already begun to move, something that did not rely on attention or acknowledgement to take effect. I looked once more toward Vanessa, who now stood beside Daniel, their posture relaxed, their expression satisfied, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as they had intended, and perhaps it had, up until this point, because they still believed that everything important had already been decided, that the future they had discussed in quiet corners of the room was already secured, that my role, or lack of one, had already been finalized. And as I sat there, composed, patient, fully aware of the shift that had just taken place, I allowed myself that same small, almost invisible smile, because control, once understood, is not something easily surrendered, and while they had spent the evening shaping a story that excluded me, they had overlooked something essential. They had assumed that I would remain exactly as they had defined me, and in that assumption, they had given me the one advantage they could not see: time. And now, as the next phase of the evening began to unfold, I knew that time was no longer on their side. By the time the next round of speeches was announced, the room had settled into a comfortable rhythm, the kind that makes people believe the evening has already reached its peak, that nothing unexpected remains. I watched as guests leaned back into their chairs, their attention drifting between conversations and the soft glow of the stage lights. And I understood that this was precisely the moment when people stopped looking for anything beyond what was being presented to them. Vanessa stepped forward once again, her hand reaching for the microphone with a confidence that suggested she had done this many times before, her posture straight, her expression composed. She thanked everyone for attending, her voice smooth and measured, each word delivered with the same careful control I had noticed earlier. She spoke about love again, about unity, about the importance of building a future together. And as she spoke, I noticed how easily the room responded, how quickly they accepted her version of events, her version of this family, as if it were the only one that had ever existed. Daniel stood just behind her, nodding occasionally, his presence supportive but secondary, as though even he had stepped into a role that had been quietly assigned to him. I folded my hands on the table, my gaze steady, my expression unchanged, because while they continued to shape the story in front of everyone, I was no longer focused on what was being said. I was focused on what was about to happen. I glanced briefly toward the entrance of the ballroom, not in anticipation, not in impatience, but in quiet acknowledgement of a timeline that was already in motion. Across the room, Olivia laughed softly at something her husband whispered to her, her attention fully absorbed in the moment, unaware of the subtle shift that was approaching, unaware that the carefully constructed narrative surrounding her was not as complete as it appeared. I returned my attention to Vanessa as she continued speaking, her words flowing seamlessly, her tone warm, inclusive. She thanked family members, friends, even distant relatives, weaving them into a tapestry of connection that felt convincing, even comforting. And still, my name remained absent, not spoken, not implied, not even hinted at. And I realized that this omission was no longer something that needed to be questioned. It was a choice that had been fully embraced, fully executed, and now fully believed by those around her. A waiter passed by, refilling glasses with quiet efficiency, and I allowed mine to remain untouched, my focus no longer on the performance unfolding on the stage, but on the quiet undercurrent that had already begun to shift beneath it. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened slightly, just enough to allow someone to enter without drawing immediate attention, and I saw him then, Robert Hayes, moving with the same calm professionalism I had always associated with him. His suit impeccable, his expression neutral. He paused briefly at the entrance, scanning the room with a practiced eye before stepping inside, blending into the background with a subtlety that matched the tone of the evening. I did not acknowledge him, not directly, not in any way that might draw attention, but I knew he had seen me, just as I had seen him, and that was enough. Vanessa's voice continued, rising slightly as she approached the conclusion of her speech, the room responding with polite smiles, nods, the occasional soft laugh. And as she spoke about the future, about the plans that lay ahead, I felt a quiet sense of certainty settle into place, because whatever future she was describing, whatever vision she was presenting to the room, was no longer the only one that mattered. I adjusted my posture slightly, sitting a bit straighter, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to look not just at the center of the room, but beyond it, to the edges, to the spaces where things moved without being noticed. Robert had made his way along the perimeter, positioning himself where he could observe without interrupting, waiting, just as I was, for the right moment. Because moments like this are not forced, they are chosen, carefully, deliberately. And as Vanessa finished her speech to a round of applause, stepping back with a satisfied smile, I understood that the next moment, the one that had not been planned, not by them, was approaching, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet precision that had defined everything else that evening. I lifted my chin slightly, my gaze steady, my expression calm. Because while they believed the evening was continuing exactly as intended, I knew something they did not. The story they had told was about to be interrupted, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more difficult to ignore, the truth, presented at exactly the right time. There is a moment in every carefully planned event when the structure holds its breath, when one part ends and another has not yet fully begun, and it is in that quiet space that everything becomes possible. I felt it as the applause for Vanessa's speech faded, as the room settled into a brief pause before the next transition, a subtle shift in energy that most people would not notice, but one that stood out clearly to me now that I understood how the evening had been constructed. I rose from my chair slowly, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, just a natural movement, as if I were simply adjusting my place within the room, my hand brushing lightly against the edge of the table as I stepped away from it, the soft fabric of my dress moving with me, the name tag still pinned neatly in place, visible, deliberate. I walked toward the center of the room with measured steps, my pace unhurried, my posture straight, and at first, no one noticed. Conversations continued, glasses were lifted, laughter lingered in small pockets around the room. But then, as I moved closer to the space where the microphone stood, a few heads began to turn, subtle at first, a glance here, a pause there, the natural curiosity that arises when something shifts slightly out of expectation. I reached the microphone just as a member of the event staff stepped forward, preparing to introduce the next segment of the evening, and I met his eyes with a calm, steady expression. Offering a small nod that required no explanation, no justification, just a quiet assurance that I knew exactly what I was doing. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping back, allowing the space to open. I adjusted the microphone gently, lowering it just enough to meet my height, my fingers steady, my movements precise, and then I turned to face the room. The conversations had begun to quiet now, not completely, but enough that a sense of attention started to gather, like a tide slowly pulling inward. Daniel was the first to fully notice, his expression shifting from casual ease to something more focused, more alert. Vanessa followed his gaze, her posture tightening almost imperceptibly as she recognized me standing there. And Olivia, still near the center of the room, turned as well, her smile faltering for just a moment before settling back into place, uncertain, questioning. I did not rush to speak. I allowed the silence to deepen, to settle naturally, because silence, when used correctly, has a way of drawing people in more effectively than any raised voice ever could. I looked out across the room, taking in the faces, the expressions, the subtle changes that moved through the crowd as they tried to understand what was happening. And then, finally, I spoke, my voice calm, clear, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room without forcing itself forward. I will only take a moment, I said, and even in that simple sentence, I could feel the shift, the attention sharpening, the room aligning itself around something it had not expected. I paused briefly, not for effect, but to allow the words to settle, to give the moment the space it needed. And then I continued. Tonight has been presented as a celebration of family, of connection, of everything that brings people together. My gaze moved slowly, deliberately, not focusing on any one person for too long, but acknowledging the room as a whole. And it is a beautiful celebration, truly. I added, my tone steady, sincere, because there was no need to deny what was visible, what had been created, what everyone could see. Another pause, small, controlled, and then I let my hand rest lightly against the edge of the podium, grounding myself in the moment. But stories, even beautiful ones, are only complete when they include all the parts that made them possible. The words were simple, measured, but they carried weight, not through volume, but through clarity. I saw the shift ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. Vanessa's expression tightening just slightly, Daniel's posture straightening, Olivia's gaze fixed more intently on me now, and still, I remained composed, unhurried, because this was not about confrontation. It was about presence, about stepping into a space that had been deliberately left empty, and allowing that presence to be recognized. I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet Robert's eyes across the room, a brief acknowledgement, nothing more, and then I returned my attention forward, my voice steady as I continued. Sometimes, absence is not what it appears to be, I said, my fingers brushing lightly against the name tag still pinned to my dress, the gesture small, but visible enough to be understood. Sometimes, it is simply the result of a story being told without all of its truth. The room had grown quiet now, fully attentive, fully present, the kind of silence that does not come from obligation, but from realization, and as I stood there, centered, composed, no longer at the edge, but fully within the space that had been denied to me, I understood that the moment had arrived, not as something forced, not as something disruptive, but as something inevitable. The truth, once seen, once understood, has a way of making itself heard, and now it was. The silence did not break all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a realization moving from one person to another, a quiet awareness spreading through the room as the weight of my words settled into place. I stood there without shifting, without adding anything more than what had already been said, because truth does not need decoration, it only needs space. And I had finally given it that. I let my gaze rest briefly on Olivia, her expression no longer certain, no longer composed in the effortless way it had been earlier. There was something else there now, something searching, something unsettled, as if she were trying to reconcile the version of the evening she had expected with the one now standing in front of her. Daniel's face had tightened, his posture rigid in a way that suggested he was trying to maintain control of a moment that was no longer his to shape. And Vanessa, for the first time that evening, had lost the ease that had defined her presence. Her smile had not returned, her eyes sharper now, calculating in a different way, not to guide the room, but to understand it, to measure what had shifted and how far it might go. I allowed another brief pause, not as hesitation, but as intention, and then I continued, my voice steady, unwavering. I have always believed that family is not defined by what is said in a room like this, but by what is done when no one is watching. I said, my tone calm, reflective, not accusatory, because accusation invites resistance, but truth invites recognition. I moved my hand slightly, not pointing, not directing, just allowing the gesture to exist naturally as part of what I was saying. And tonight, I have listened carefully to everything that has been said, every story, every acknowledgement, every carefully chosen word. I glanced down briefly at the program that someone had left on the podium, then back up again, and I realized something very simple. Another pause, controlled, deliberate. A story can feel complete, even when it is missing its foundation. The words settled into the room differently this time, not as a statement to be heard, but as something to be understood. I could see it in the way people shifted slightly in their seats, in the way attention sharpened, not out of politeness, but out of genuine curiosity, because now they were no longer just listening. They were thinking. I reached up then, gently, and removed the name tag from my dress, holding it between my fingers for a moment before placing it on the podium in front of me, the small card suddenly carrying more weight than anything else in the room. This, I said softly, is what I was given when I arrived tonight. I did not raise it, did not display it dramatically. I simply allowed it to be seen, to exist in the same quiet, undeniable way everything else had unfolded, and I accepted it. I continued. Because sometimes, the easiest way to understand a story is to let it play out exactly as it was written. I lifted my eyes again, meeting the room with the same calm presence I had held all evening. But I think it is only fair that everyone here understands something. That was not included. There was a shift now, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that comes when a moment begins to change direction. I turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge Robert as he stepped forward from the edge of the room, his presence drawing attention without needing to demand it. He moved with quiet confidence, stopping a few steps behind me, and I continued. Every detail of this evening, from the venue to the smallest arrangement, was made possible by someone who was not mentioned, not acknowledged, and, until a few minutes ago, not even seen. I did not look at Vanessa, did not look at Daniel, because this was not about them directly. This was about the truth itself. And while I have never needed recognition to do what I believed was right for my family, I do believe. In clarity, I rested my hand lightly on the podium, grounding the moment once more. So tonight, I would like to offer that clarity. I stepped back slightly, just enough to allow Robert to come forward if needed, but I did not rush the moment, did not force anything beyond what was already unfolding naturally. The room remained still, attentive, the kind of silence that no longer belonged to the event, but to the moment itself. And as I looked out across the faces in front of me, I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a steady, quiet certainty, because the story had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. And for the first time that evening, I was no longer at the edge of it. I was standing exactly where I had always belonged, in the center of the truth. In this powerful collection of family stories, an elderly mother attends her granddaughter's wedding only to discover she has been quietly erased from her own family's narrative. Labeled as absent, she observes in silence as her son and daughter-in-law reshape the truth in front of everyone. These family stories reveal how subtle manipulation, emotional distance, and calculated control can redefine relationships without confrontation. As the grandmother begins to understand the depth of betrayal, she shifts from quiet observer to a woman reclaiming her place with calm precision. Through layered tension and emotional clarity, these family stories explore themes of dignity, legacy, and the unseen sacrifices of a mother. The conflict between the mother and the daughter-in-law builds toward a powerful moment where truth replaces illusion. These family stories highlight how presence cannot be erased by silence. In the end, the grandmother transforms from overlooked to undeniable, proving that even in the most controlled environments, truth has a way of being heard. These family stories leave a lasting impact through quiet strength and emotional realism. Character 1 is a 67-year-old white grandmother with silver hair and blue eyes. She wears an elegant navy formal dress. She stands facing forward with a calm expression. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Character 2 is a 42-year-old white daughter-in-law with blonde hair and sharp features. She wears a sophisticated cream formal dress. She faces forward with a composed expression. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration.